Hey there, I'm Lee Ullman here with some big news from the National Young Farmers Coalition. We're partnering with Heritage Radio Network on a special season of The Farm Report. It's all about what's happening with the Farm Bill and how it impacts farmers and eaters.
I am growing diversified vegetables on land that's been in our family for 150 years.
And so with the pandemic, gentrification, property values going up, we had to sell the land and we lost it.
Join us as we uncover the untold stories behind this massive piece of legislation that shapes how we grow our food, what we eat, and so much more.
The problems we have had, those are things that come from earlier Farm Bill and USDA policy, right? Like Earl Butz, get big or get out.
You know, it's my responsibility to know not only what I'm eating, but then like how that all came to be. And realize like, wow, like this piece of legislation, all this money, like it's technically something that I support as a taxpayer.
While Congress debates the next Farm Bill, this is not just an invitation to listen. It's a call to action. Be part of the conversation. Subscribe to the Farm Report on Heritage Radio Network, wherever you listen to podcasts.
Today's program is brought to you by Wisconsin Cheese. Did you know that Wisconsin is home to the nation's only Master Cheesemakers program that provides innovative cheesemakers with continuing education opportunities? To learn more, visit wisconsincheese.com.
You're listening to Heritage Radio Network. We're a member-supported food radio network broadcasting over 35 weekly shows live from Bushwick, Brooklyn. Join our hosts as they lead you through the world of craft brewing, behind the scenes of the restaurant industry, inside the battle over school food, and beyond. Find us at heritageradionetwork.org.
Oh, I like the way you do. Whoa.
Hey, you're listening to Eat Your Words on Heritage Radio Network, and I'm your host, Cathy Erway. We're here on a Sunday in Brooklyn, and in February, it's actually just after the Lunar New Year, so Gong Chi Fat Sad, anyone celebrating? But we're going to take a little different tack today than that. We're going to talk about hippie food. And actually this morning, I didn't realize I was eating something that was very much in the vein or in the legacy of hippie food, but I ate granola and yogurt this morning. I was actually kind of proud of myself, being a little healthy, but that's a very normal thing nowadays, and I didn't really think of how it had become so through this amazing food movement that is chronicled in the book I'm holding right now. It's wonderful. It's called Hippie Food: How Back to the Landers, Longhairs, and Revolutionaries Changed the Way We Eat. And the author is Jonathan Kauffman, who's on the phone right now from San Francisco. Hi, Jonathan.
Hey, Cathy. Thanks for having me on the show.
Hey, thanks so much. And so you're a longtime James Beard Award-winning staff writer at the San Francisco Chronicle, restaurant critic. And this is, by the way, congratulations. You guys recently launched a really cool guide to Chinese food in the Bay Area.
We've been working on that for about 6 to 8 months. So it's a guide to regional Chinese cuisines in the Bay Area with about 36 restaurants representing 17 cuisines.
Wow, that's extensive. It looked amazing, by the way, too. Looked really cool.
Thank you.
So this is looking to be a really, really great year of the dog for you. Hippie Food has...
So far, it has really shaped up pretty well.
Nice. Yeah, Hippie Food has gotten some amazing accolades. Well-deserved. But
thank you.
And it's been a long work for you. 5 years or so researching and writing.
Yeah. Writing a book while you have a full-time writing job is a little taxing sometimes. But it was also such a pleasure to research, getting to talk to hundreds of people who'd had these amazing, lives in their teenage and 20 years that kept me going.
I really love the anecdote you write that when you ask a lot of people, how did this happen? Or how did you get the idea to do that? And a lot of people said magic as their answer. So this book is about how this very radical movement hippies, counterculturalists, and so forth, really changed the way we eat. And, we live now in a world where brown rice, whole wheat bread is de facto choices. But also specifically talking about like the nitty gritty of hippie food, or the grainy, crunchy granola of hippie food. This is actually your comfort food, right? This is what you grew up on. It really is.
I had, for years I had these, like, people would talk about their comfort food, and, I would hear stories about, mashed potatoes and macaroni and cheese. And to me, like, the thing that resets my system is, a big plate of brown rice with tofu stir fry with just, like, simple tamari sauce. It's just, like, I don't know. It comforts me, and also comforts me that I feel like I'm being healthy.
Yeah, and that's a not so unusual thing, because you're right. A vast generation of people, not just in the cities, not just in urban areas, but where you grew up in Indiana, for instance, followed this wave of eating.
Yeah, so. and that was when I was both pitching the book to publishers and as I was trying to think about how to structure the book, I kept getting these questions. Oh, well, this was a coastal movement. Obviously this wasn't. This was only sort of the hippie enclaves. But as somebody who grew up with politically liberal parents in a small town in Indiana, and we were eating all of this food, I wondered, like, how had the food spread so far across the country so quickly in the 70s?
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't magic.
Hey,
you
never know.
Magic.
Maybe magic mushroom? No. Okay, sorry. No, to give people a slice of what this book is all about, I thought I'd read one paragraph from the intro, if that's all right.
Sure.
Great. So you're right. Young Americans wanted to strip their cuisine back to its pre-industrial roots. And then they tried to figure out what they should eat instead of the military-industrial trash. A reactionary generation sought counsel from the fringes. They found it in health food faddists, rogue nutritionists, mystical German farmers, Japanese dietary prophets, and nameless cooks from countries that their parents had barely dreamed of visiting. That Harvard nutritionist or newspaper journalist thought these sources were all bunk only validated that the counterculture was on the right track. I think that really succinks a lot of the movements you're going to talk about in this book. And also the momentum and philosophies behind why.
Yeah, and when I was talking, another thing, when I was talking to people, they would talk a lot about idealism. We were trying to create a healthier diet. We were trying to create a diet that was better for the earth, but behind that also was fear and disillusionment. And so there was a real emotional push, this sort of disillusionment over the civil rights movement, or the abuses that produced the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War, and worrying over all of the chemicals that were in the food supply that had been introduced just in the past 25 years. So there was a real, I think there was a critique of what they were eating that was emerging during that time that is still very present today.
Yeah, I was really intrigued by, this sounds like during this time, late 60s, 70s, people were forming an idea around food as being a political thing. Eating was a political act, which is something that, we talk about a lot on this station, but today in the food movement as well.
Yeah, and you can see that shift in cookbooks. If you look at sort of both the normal cookbooks and health food cookbooks from the early 60s, they mention nutrition. They'll talk about flavor. Right. There's obviously with some cookbooks there's like a class aspiration, but it really wasn't until the early 70s that the tone became very political, and this idea that what we buy and what we put in our bodies could have these broader reaching effects on the world.
This was all very, very radical, very, very counterculture then. But I'm looking at this this passage you include from the Rainbow Party, formerly known as the White Panthers. that was written in the Ann Arbor Sun in 1972, and somebody wrote, more and more people are realizing that the industry in control of providing food for the people is in fact ripping them off. The food industry is one small part of the larger corporate structure whose only interest is in making money, and the deadly chemicals that are put into virtually every food on the market shelf is made to make foods last longer, taste better, or look better, blah, 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 but it's destroying your body and, its energy. It seems like, if not using such harsh words, a lot of people would sort of shrug and take and accept for fact a lot of those ethos today. Food is not entirely intended for the in our best interest for health,
right?
But for profit. And that was crazy.
And
then.
That's why, in some ways, this is a movement that didn't fail necessarily.
Yeah.
I mean, it didn't convert the entire country to vegetarianism. It didn't, completely change the agricultural system or the way food is distributed, because they had all these they also had all these economic goals as well, these anti-capitalist goals.
Sure.
But at the same time, I think it introduced a critique and also an alternate path that has only continued to widen as time has gone on,
right,
and become more accessible to people.
Sure. Let's talk about some of those. Let's go back to some of the earliest pioneers. Some of these German philosophers or nutritionists are really, really interesting. So let's go back to California, Northern California. Or is it Northern? I don't know. Maybe around, actually Los Angeles, late 50s. Yeah. Arnold Ehler.
Ehret?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, yes. He was one of my... I actually fell in love with the health food movements of the early 20th century because they are so far out there at times. Mm-hmm. Arnold Ehret was he was a German... I guess he became sort of a nutritional guru who moved to Los Angeles after being in a proto-hippie commune in sort of Central Europe before that. And he had this whole theory that all disease was caused by mucus building up in the bloodstream, and so the only way to sort of clear it from your bloodstream was you couldn't just avoid eating mucus-producing foods like meat and starches. You had to slowly remove them from your bloodstream, or else it would just sort of pour out in this great sort of body revenge of the mucus, and you would ooze from your from your veins and from your bowels. It was
definitely fear factor.
He was pretty descriptive in his terms in his sort of ideas of what mucus was and what it would do to the body.
But he introduced the idea that you should eat more vegetables and eat. Essentially, you say that he advocated a diet that was maybe good for lorikeets or arboreal sloths. Stewed fruits, salads.
Yeah, it was all raw,
boiled,
sometimes a little steamed, and toasted bread.
Wild or far out.
But Steve Jobs was following the Ehret diet. In the 1960s, it sort of was this thing that people were doing. They were fasting and becoming fruitarians, partly in response because of his books.
Hey, cleanses, yeah.
So,
and then we talk about, he inspired a lot of people, and he and other thinkers around that era of nutritionism and weird fad diets. But let's talk about a name that a lot of people might know. I forget his first name, but his last name is Bragg. What is
Paul Bragg.
Yes. So he's actually very aptly named. He also introduced the idea of beauty being a goal or a result of eating this diet that he was going around preaching about and selling products about, because he would pose with his muscular torso in every single photo of him.
Mm-hmm. So he was part of this, part of the reason that Southern California became such a mecca for health food was that because people had moved there, sort of if they had tuberculosis, but then Hollywood swept in, and so all of a sudden beauty became a big part of the mix, and so Paul Bragg was kind of the proto Gwyneth Paltrow in the sense that he was like advocating these, raw food, healthy diets that were supposed to make you beautiful and strong. Mm-hmm. But he also I haven't done all the research, so I can't really comment on his qualifications, but there are some people who have online, and they have a lot of doubts about the degrees that he produced, that he claimed. Mm-hmm. And his daughter-in-law, Patricia Bragg, is still around. He calls her his daughter because she divorced his son, and then he kind of adopted her, and she took over the family business, and really was the person who made Bragg's liquid amino acids and apple cider vinegar popular.
Wow. Well, he also was a staunch advocate for live foods, so things with cultures. But also the the vinegars, right, and the probiotics and so forth, and that's something that is very much a huge, I guess, trend you could say today.
Yeah, but back then they were focused on the idea of vitality because so much of it was they were promising miracle cures, and so vital foods, were live and living. But we just have a slightly different. We've adopted some of the same products. We've just sort of shifted the way we talk about them.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's jump forward to another entirely different pioneer, but a very influential one, macrobiotics. So this is one genre of eating that I think most made fun of. It kind of has that smack of, going a little too far out there, but I'm not sure if that's because it's more known than some of these lesser known sort of mucus whatever diets too. So, okay, so what's his story? The founder, the guru of macrobiotics.
Yeah, George Osawa was born in Japan around the turn of the last century, and he became part of this movement in Japan to rid the Japanese diet of Western influences and return to a peasant diet, which he said was, responsible for the Western diet was responsible for ill health, and so he came to the United States in 1960 and started lecturing about how the American diet was causing heart disease and obesity and cancer, and that we should eat a local, seasonal, organic food, which all sounds amazing. But then he also believed, he had these ideas of what foods were yin and yang that was very different from traditional Chinese notions. And he said you had to balance them in your body. But brown rice was the perfect food, and if you ate nothing but brown rice for 10 days, you could cure your body of entire ills, of all of its ills.
Okay. I'm sure that's very easy to try.
He also believed that smoking was yangizing, and that if you needed to make new friends, you should be eating a little bit more sesame seeds toasted and sprinkled with salt on your rice. And
if you wanted
some of his early followers gave themselves scurvy.
Oh no!
Because all they were eating was brown rice.
Oh man! So we have to cut to a quick little commercial break, but I want to talk about how even though these are, there's many more instances of more far-flung cultures that have influenced this movement is predominantly white. So let's talk a little bit more about that right after a quick little commercial break.
Today's program was brought to you by Wisconsin Cheese. What do you think of when you hear Wisconsin cheese? For me, I think cheese curds. Delicious, fresh and squeaky cheese curds. Or deep-fried cheese curds. Cheese curds literally any way, anytime, any place. I think about Andy Hatch and Upland's Cheese, the farmstead cheese company behind Pleasant Ridge Reserve. I think of delicious stinky Limburger and its long storied history. I think of Dunbarton Blue, made by master cheesemaker Chris Rowley. I think of Ross Grand Cru Surchoix, which was named 2016's World Championship cheese, and Sartori's Black Pepper Bella Vitano, the 2017 U.S. Championship cheese. Wisconsin produces the world's best cheese, with lush grasslands and a glacial water supply that produce the very best milk,
fourth-generation cheesemakers combine old-world tradition with new ideas and the highest standards to make innovative cheeses that win more awards than any other state or country. To learn more, visit wisconsincheese.com.
All right, we're back chatting more with Jonathan Kauffman, the author of Hippie Food, How Back-to-Landers, Longhairs, and Revolutionaries Change the Way We Eat. Hey, Jonathan, you still there?
Yep, still here.
Awesome. So you write in the beginning that as you were tracing the history and looking around and asking all these folks and pioneers and researching them, you found very little in the way of other minorities involved in this movement.
Yeah. And, which is particularly interesting because so many of the culinary influences that the movement was adopting were from Asia and Central America.
You write that, in your chapter all about vegetarians on the curry trail, which is something I think we can all recognize, vegetarian food, curry food, and then bing, bang, boom, you got all of these great dishes now being embraced by the hippie food movement. But this generation was willing to pluck any idea out of the fringe and test it out, whether it came from occult bookstores, Chinatown acupuncturists, or health food stores. They willed this new cuisine into existence. Then came the real struggle of making it delicious. So where vegetarians were concerned, they looked to sources from India, China, Japan, and so forth with long histories of vegetarian cuisine. Yet, okay, I have to say, I didn't grow up with hippie food but I came from a half Chinese household. So, looking at, tempeh and tofu eaten in the manner of, I guess, the back-to-the-landers, it looked humorous, but also more or less like putting tofu in a juxtaposition that was otherwise Western. And it was a very different genre of food, it seems.
Yeah, and so part of that I think is influenced by the fact that but the United States was 87% white then, and it was really before the effects of the 1965 immigration shift were kind of taking hold in cities, and immigration patterns were changing, and the United States was becoming less white, and so you had all of these sort of counterculture kids who'd grown up in the segregated United States, who had were falling in love with the romance of other countries, but their exposure to it was through travel, which had become a lot cheaper, or through sort of fantasizing about other cultures, or through their interest in Indian and Japanese spiritual traditions. And so it was like they had no actual day-to-day exposure with the cuisines that they were trying to make. And so everything kind of became... and then they were also trying to make it with whole grains and other vegetarian staples. So it just kind of created this mishmash that had very little to do with the originating culture that they were taking food from.
Do you think that this is a unique cuisine of its own? This hippie food? I
do, and I think that's what I started trying to write about, because the dishes that I sort of think of as hippie food, things like steamed vegetables with tahini sauce or nut burgers and loaves, they're mostly disappearing. And so when I realized that they were disappearing, I realized that they had to come from somewhere, and to look at the cuisine as its own thing, sort of set in time, was the starting point of all of my research.
Yeah, and it's evolved though too. I think that part of the problem wasn't just that they were adopting all of these new ingredients like brown rice and whole wheat bread that they had no idea what to do with, but it was also that they were trying to make a lot of dishes given the food supply chain of in America in 1970s, and so what we have access today
too, is just remarkable. I mean, even in Indiana, when I go back to Indiana and go to the grocery store, they have like 4 aisles of natural foods and like, a huge organic produce selection that includes all of these vegetables that nobody had ever heard of in 1970.
Uh-huh. So do you think that the hippie food culture and the recipes, that these cookbooks of the time sort of cemented, do you think that cuisine has taken a hit in today's day and age where we have terms like cultural appropriation and a lot more representation of the traditional cuisines of India and China and so forth? And Latin American countries too.
Through the lens of what we know today and what we think of today. Mm-hmm. But I also think it's interesting to sort of abstract them from that sort of critique as well, and sort of look at how they might have come about.
Right.
In the absence of any sort of understanding and naivete around race and culture.
And yet, I think that there's different purposes. Nowadays, these terms and the critique of, let's say, cultural appropriation has much been around profiting off of other people's cultures. So when we see, very elite, sort of like high class bougie circles using turmeric in lattes, it's a little bit different than saying seeing like a scrap cookbook for people who are just very scrappy and trying to make tempeh burgers.
Right. So much of that movement was anti-capitalist. It was about food for people, not for profit, and about what you could make on the cheap and how you could eat healthfully and how everybody should be eating in a way that's more healthfully. And so, so much of that movement, like so many other food, aspects of food have been taken over by sort of high capitalism and these sort of class aspirations, that I think tainted it in a way that's very different.
Yes, very, very different. I think now it's curious to see those parallels continuing, but for very different ideals, I think. So you focus your book on the food movements in the U.S., although at times research took you to enclaves in other countries and cities like Montreal, for instance. But you said, that Americans in the U.S. in particular, we have a queer eagerness to abandon the culinary wisdom of the generations that preceded us. Why do you think this is distinctly an American thing? Or do you?
No, I do. I think to me it's because when I was looking at the motivations for why people were adopting, all of these new foods, it had nothing to do with the way cuisine develops just sort of wherever traditionally. It wasn't about the products that were around them, like what they could harvest from the land and what they could, how they could make subsistence food good. But it was really about making conscious political choices in an era when you could find, lots of products on the shelf that were, it's a very different way of looking at creating cuisine.
Mm-hmm. There was an awesome review of your book by Michael Pollan recently in the New York Times. He mentioned that Americans perhaps did not have as deep of roots or didn't have as much of a pride in their own culinary heritage in a way that made them not as susceptible to marketers and fad diets and, junk nutritionists and so forth. Than maybe Europeans would and other countries who have a very long history behind their cuisine.
Mm-hmm.
So
it sort of continues. Like we hear that turmeric has antioxidants or whatever we've decided turmeric has, from the scientific literature, and so we're putting turmeric in lots of things. Mm-hmm. Or we hear that probiotics are good, and so all of a sudden we were drinking apple cider for breakfast and making apple cider
shrub
sodas.
Was it called Schwingle or I don't know Swingle? Something like Switchel. Okay, yeah.
We are a gullible people.
Yeah, we are. Constantly crazed. So, but you also have written, and for The New Yorker, in a series that was about some of the fails of this generation, their failures. So you read about carob, which was supposed to be a replacement for chocolate. didn't go as planned.
Carob was the great trauma of my youth.
No.
And every time I would talk about this book with people who were my age, who were born in the 70s and grew up with it, the thing that people would bring up was like, oh my God, and then we had to eat carob.
Why was
and in
this
fact,
so
when
bad?
the article from the New Yorker came out, it was like I'd unleashed this sort of wave of horrified nostalgia from.
What? I've never
really
had
disgusting.
it. Why was it so bad?
It's because we were told it was chocolate. They sort of, all the recipes in 1970 just sort of omitted chocolate and then replaced it with carob powder and carob chips. And candy bars in health food stores were all made with carob. And so kids like us were like impressed. This is what we were given and told we could eat, whereas everybody around us was eating actual chocolate.
Oh man, trauma. So what were there any other hugely unsuccessful food replacement attempts that you're going to continue on?
I think that was the worst of them for me. I still am no fan of alfalfa sprouts. Still, and I do not get the point of wheat germ. Mm-hmm. But those have sort of faded a little bit as well.
Some have become a little bit more mainstream, even though they were a little weird. I mean, I don't know if kale is part of the hippie. I think somewhat, to some degree.
I think it was one of those things that was easy to grow, and it was earthy and chewy, and those were two, when they were trying to like rid their diet of processed food, anything that was earthy and chewy and like dark in hue was better for you. So that's why I think the hippies got associated with kale.
And certainly organic food. The word organic,
and it was really interesting to me how connected that was to the Back to the Land movement and all of these sort of counterculture kids who moved to rural areas and then tried picking up farming, and so they brought all these ideas about avoiding pesticides and growing organically to all of these rural areas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you could almost say that this hippie food is really traces the history of quote unquote organic food too. You have like the first mention of it. Somebody used it in their, I think their cookbook or something, and then it continues throughout the story. So
and it wasn't just the way people grew food, but like the market for organic food. I mean, they started up farmers markets, they started up food co-ops, so they created this whole infrastructure for making the organic food industry come into being.
And then unfortunately sort of killing it by like making it too broad and so forth, that it has less meaning today, I think, than it used to. Well, so much to say about this book, so much to cover that we didn't even talk about yet, but it looks like we're about out of time for today. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for joining us. This is a really fun
thanks
show.
for having me on the show. It was delightful.
Yeah, this is such a fun read. I hope everyone checks out Hippie Food, just out from William Morrow this month. I'm sure you'll be hearing more about it as well. But thanks again, Jonathan, and congrats. And thanks, everyone at Heritage. We'll see you next week on Eat Your Words.
Thanks for listening to Heritage Radio Network, food radio supported by you. For our freshest content and to hear about exclusive events, subscribe to our newsletter. Enter your email at the bottom of our website, heritageradionetwork.org. Connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at heritage_radio. Heritage Radio Network is a nonprofit organization driving conversations to make the world a better, fairer, more delicious place. And we couldn't do it without support from listeners like you. Want to be a part of the food world's most innovative community? Rate the shows you like, tell your friends, and please join our community by becoming a member. Just click on the beating heart at the top right of our homepage. Thanks for listening.
That I ain't never had no loving like this before.